Hello, everybody. Welcome, welcome. See a lot of familiar faces here. I'm excited for this one today. As you see in the comments, have surmised we were working on this photo of the heron. If you're new, you'll find the reference photo in the description underneath the video, so feel free to bring that up. I've got it printed out here. I also have one on the screen in front of me. But this is what we're going to be working with today, and this was just kind of a fun one. I wasn't really planning on using this as a subject when I was out taking photos. I was actually taking photos for Friday's class, which is drawing a tree. We've got these big gnarled old trees in the area here in Colorado. And as I was walking past the ponds on the way back, this guy here jumped into the water, grabbed a fish, and then hopped back out on this stump in the water, and I thought, that's perfect. So today we're really going to be focusing a lot actually on the reflections. I've had quite a few of you ask about drawing water and reflections, so I thought this worked out really well as dealing with some of the texture in the feathers. Working with graphite today, or actually I'm going to be working with these ebony pencils. If you have graphite, a regular number 2 pencil will work just fine. If you have something that's softer, like a 6B or an 8B, that's going to actually work out better. And then I do have a carbon pencil that I'll use to pull in just in some of the fine details, some of these richer darks to help pull this forward. And I chose these materials because just kind of looking at the subject, there's kind of a silvery quality to the bird itself. And I don't have to cover a whole lot of ground with this, so I'm not really kind of bearing down on this, and so I thought it'd just be a good opportunity to use these materials. And then Jam, you had a question about the paper and how I choose what to work with. I tend to gravitate towards paper that actually has a bit more tooth. A lot of artists that I know at work, especially in graphite, prefer a smoother surface like a vellum. And I actually kind of find that having something that at least has some sort of tooth to it is helpful, because I can get the detail if I need it, but sometimes the texture of the paper brings something to the drawing that I can't kind of replicate with my pencil. There's just kind of a natural quality to it. And so this is just a regular kind of drawing paper. I believe it's a Strathmore paper. Fairly smooth. It's not the cotton rag that I prefer to use when working with charcoal. So I've got those two. I've got my trusty erasers, my kneaded eraser, my rubber eraser, and of course my shading stump. So welcome everybody. We're going to dig right into it. And as you can see, I've already started to tone the paper here. With my pencil, I've shaved away the core the casing of the pencil to expose the core, to give myself a kind of a broader surface to help build up some value. And this I find is really helpful because then I can erase out some of the highlights, and it's going to actually help with some of the texture here. So it's a fairly light value, but I just like to get rid of that pure white as much as possible. And then it's going to help me, I think, with the overall tone. And you're going to see how when I start to create the reflections, especially up here at the top, you see how that's going to be useful to use both the eraser and the graphite. So before I get any farther, though, I just want to start to place the heron on the page here and start to look at the overall shape and the size of things. So some of the key points that I'm looking for is if I can find the center of the paper somewhere right around here, I can see that the log is just offset to the right. So even the far left side of it is still to the right of that center line. And that's going to help me as a guide point. So if I can find that center, which is roughly here, I can place that the log over here to the right of that. Then I can also try to find the central line here. So if I use the base of the water line against the log, I can compare that to the center point, and you can see that it's a little bit below center. The center of the paper runs right around through here, and I want to make sure that I have plenty of room for the bird. I need space above, and I need kind of space below. So I can start to kind of define that just by dropping some kind of marks on the page. Kind of looking at roughly placing that water line on there, looking for the rough shape of the log. I'm not looking for anything specific at this point because once I block this in, I'm really actually utilizing this as a way to help orient myself when working with the water, and I'm going to build my way from the background forward. But I need to, again, have myself oriented properly. And now we can see in the photograph that reflection is all broken up by the ripples that are left over from when he jumped into the water there. But what I'm going to try to do is kind of at least give myself a rough indication of that general shape of darkness under here, so that I can make sure that everything is going to fit. And I'm going to kind of work basically both above and below the water line as I go. And anybody, if you're new, feel free to call out any questions as I go along. It's helpful if you type them in all caps, so I'm more likely to see them. So just some thoughts there. Keeping the marks really light and loose, and you can see that I'm using the side of the pencil. I don't want to get involved with detail at this point. Kind of looking for that rough shape of that bird. I'm not refining it. And you're going to see why as I start to work with the reflections here, why I don't want to get too bogged down in details. I'm working on that S curve of the neck, and I love that curve because it, especially at this point, it actually comes back up and then down and around. It's a really particular curve that is worth taking some time to really observe. And it's not just a solid S. You know, look for areas where it might be more straight, more rounded. You know, that curve is always changing. So just kind of roughing in the placement of the bird again, not getting too specific, but as helpful as I make this initial pass to prime my mind with some of the things that are going to be challenging later on. I'm kind of taking in all of those details in my mind and trying to figure out how am I going to tackle those. I see some negative space issues here. Actually, I think I want to keep the bird where it is right now. And I think I want to start to drop that log down a little bit, bring it down just a touch. Doing some angle sighting, so looking for that angle from the beak to the right edge there helps me to place the far right. Why would it not yet? Okay, that was weird. Hopefully that wasn't interrupted. I just got a notification asking me if I wanted to end the stream, which I don't. So I'm hoping that we're going to avoid some technical issues today. We seem to have been plagued by them over some of them last week. Just roughing in the shape of the reflection here, just to make sure that it's all going to fit. So if I place the top of the bird here, the water line somewhere around here, and then that bottom part of the reflection is going to come somewhere down around there. I think that's going to fit nicely. A little bit asymmetrical there. So you can see just kind of a faint image now, and what I want to do is now to kind of block in some of those reflections. Like I said, I think I want to work from kind of the top down. It's a bit challenging right now working with the paper taped down like this. I think if it wasn't streaming right now, I would have this kind of more loose and I'd be able to turn and rotate and give myself some more room to maneuver. So if you're following along, you don't necessarily have to follow my kind of exact movement here. Try to find something that is comfortable to you. But what I'm working on right now is kind of building up some of those large masses of those reflections and keeping my marks horizontal, which starts to mimic and kind of create the gesture of the reflections there. And I'm not being too precise right now. I just want to be thinking through those major masses. And if you're having trouble seeing those, then let your eyes lose focus or kind of blur your eyes a bit, and that'll help you to see that general shape. And as with other drawings in the series, ask yourself, how critical is it to match the photograph one-to-one? For me, especially with a subject that's moving like this, having it match one-to-one is less critical. I want to capture the overall kind of spirit of the place, the essence of it, you know, looking kind of critically not at the specific lines that I'm seeing, but what happens in the drawing that gives me an indication of the reflections that I'm seeing. And what I mean by that is, you know, as we look at the shapes of especially these dark forms, they change as we move back along the surface plane of the water. They're a little bit more open here as we're looking down at them. As we lift our eyes up, we're shearing across the lake more, and those lines just get thinner and thinner and more kind of delicate. And so even if our marks don't perfectly match the photograph, we can use our marks to simulate that same type of effect. So as we start to block in those shapes, now I can take my eraser. I have it kind of shaved off. It's a little dull right now, but I can kind of essentially just kind of replicate that that same kind of motion, the same thinking as I was with the graphite, with the ebony pencil. And I'm keeping it light and loose. I'm trying to think about it really as much as of a drawing tool as it is a correcting tool. I'm not correcting, I'm actually drawing reflections here, and I'm trying to sneak up on them. So I'm just creating these horizontal lines, trying to get a feel for the arm movement more than anything. And what I found in doing the initial drawing for this is that you get to sneak up on the values here. We're going to be gradually allowing this to emerge. We have a question here about the video. This will be posted as a video immediately following the live event. So if you can't make it through the entire one, you're going to be just fine. You can watch the recording later. So now you can see that I placed the heron, but now I'm kind of removing him. I'm letting those marks in the reflection kind of overtake the form of the heron. That's going to allow me to create some clear overlapping. And I want these reflections on the surface of the water to feel like they continue from one side to the other. And similar to how I hold the pencil, I'm really just kind of scraping it on its side. And again, I'm building up the pressure as I go. Kind of, again, just kind of sneaking up on those. Just these light back and forth marks. And there's just some natural kind of smudging that's happening too that starts to mimic the reflections in the water. One of the things that's really helpful is I have this bar here along the bottom of this easel that I can feel on my arm, and that helps me to orient myself and keep these marks horizontal. So as I'm making them, I'm trying to be aware of the borders of the paper. And in terms of trying to keep my marks horizontal, I'm trying to put my awareness on this top edge. So kind of out of my peripheral vision, I'm just kind of observing that and trying to make sure, see if my hand movement kind of matches that horizontal edge. And then there's this nice clear black line along here. And that's going to be a nice orientation point. I've still got enough of the bird there to know where that line should be. And now, with that eraser mark, I'm kind of working my way down. I can actually start to draw in that reflection, at least kind of place it. I kind of dip down there. That's not really a nice straight line. So I'm going to have to come in and adjust that. So that line is too big, it's too thick, but I can use my eraser to sharpen it back up. And this isn't finishing at this point. I mean, there may be an instinct right now to kind of make these marks permanent. This is all going to be refined and adjusted later as we go along. So All right. Let's see, I'm kind of losing some of the forms here, so I want to make sure I give myself enough space. I feel like that is too high, so I'm going to bring that down. And it's easy enough to do just by using my eraser to drop it. Keeping just enough of that, the placement of the bird visible, so that I can come back in later and refine it. You know, another kind of technique for creating these horizontal lines is to hold it kind of like this. This is an overhand grip. This is what we're going to use at the top of the page. And so you can see that it's not one mark that goes across. I'm taking multiple stabs. You know, probably 20 to 30 marks are accumulating together to create that one horizontal edge, that one horizontal line. I'm going to erase this down so the log is going to kind of cut in on top of that. Just utilizing the side of my pencil here so that I'm thinking in terms of shape, not necessarily in terms of line for this log. And I want to do that for the heron as well. And one of the advantages to that as I tip this ebony pencil on its side is that it's going to help me to keep that point sharp for when I need it in detail in the bird later. So I need to kind of establish that, and there's a nice light striking the water on this side. So I want to be careful of the direction of my mark. So if you need to, go right over the edge of that log. Because you can always place it back again, but you want to be careful of those kind of halos. Kind of as we work right up to the edge of an object, we can sometimes, you know, leave a halo that ends up flattening the drawing. There's a very kind of gestural kind of thinking to these marks here. So I'm observing within this kind of ring that's of ripples around the log, there are these kind of shorter, choppier marks. So I can just let my marks become shorter and choppier, kind of reacting to the kind of the nature of the water, rather than thinking too specifically about, you know, does that specific mark match what I see on the page. I'm just learning from the photograph to see what is useful, what's happening in those marks. So how do those marks change in quality? All right, so I can start to block in this shape here. I don't want to get too specific, but this again just helps me to orient myself. I'm gonna come back to that lower portion later as I work my way down, in part because I know this hand is going to be resting on the page and it's going to smudge out everything that's happening in there anyways. So I'm not going to give really much attention at all to this. As long as the scale that I'm working with right now for the log is going to be sufficient for what I need in the bird. So. And now I can start to kind of refine those marks a little bit more. I've got the general, that ghosty form right over there. But I need to be mindful that that could all change. Looking for the general axis of that. Some of those initial marks for the head are a little bit off. I want to move those around. Just using the side of the pencil here, again, just to block it in, so I'm not thinking too much in terms of line. Okay, I'm just taking a measurement, the width of that log, compare that to the height of the bird. So I take that, turn it up. Okay. So if that's the measurement, then actually I think I've made that bird a bit too small, but I think what I want to do actually is make the log bigger. So I like the scale of the bird right now, but I want to make sure that the overall proportions relationship between the bird and that log are pretty consistent. So I can take that there. That's a little bit better. So what I'm looking at is this measurement from end to end here, the log, is a bit greater than the distance from the water line to the top of the bird. So the bird needs to come down a little bit. I'll refine that a little bit later. All right. So I think I have enough of the bird indicated here, and that helps me to adjust any of the reflections here at the top, which we haven't really gotten to. We've still only just kind of masked them in. So what I want to do, start to refine that. And we're going to sneak up on these reflections, and I think once we get through this pass, we probably won't have to go back to the top again. So I'm holding it in an overhand grip, and that allows me to rest these fingers right here on the top, giving me a bit more stability. And I'm just kind of working back and forth. And I'm looking at the reference photo and the drawing, kind of moving my eyes back and forth throughout that. It's fairly dark right up here along that whole edge. And I'm really thinking about letting the weight of the pencil do the work. And as I need to darken certain areas, I can just kind of lean into it a little bit. But in a way, it's almost like this thumb here is lifting the pencil off the page, and then these fingers are pushing down. And so it's just a kind of it's a balance and tension between those two that I'm controlling to make lighter or darker marks. Because sometimes I may not even want to have a mark. I just want to make sure I have my marks running horizontally. And as I need to make things darker, I can just kind of lean in on it a little bit more. There's a bit of a sharper edge on this side. And so I can let my marks run a little bit short. Still thinking about the overall masses of them, but you can see that the reflection are already starting to show. We can see the ripples here, and I'm keeping these marks fairly close together. And it kind of reinforces the fact that that's farther away, and it's closer to our eye level. We're shearing across the lake to see those, and then as a result, when we get down to the bottom here, as we open up those marks and create them with greater spacing, it'll reinforce the surface plane of the water. And one of the things I'm also trying to be mindful of is kind of lifting off the page at the end. It's almost like I'm rocking like this. That's really kind of an exaggerated motion, but you get kind of the idea that it's not bearing into the end point. It's lifting up at the end and then back down and up at the end there. And that helps to create a more refined mark as well. So again, very gestural thinking in that I'm not matching marks one-to-one, but I'm trying to mimic the quality of the marks that I'm seeing in the photo. And then there are areas, if I need to, I can come back in, erase out some highlights, and work them back and forth. Highlights to kind of the shadow areas in the reflection. And one of the things that I'm seeing happening is these forms, there's kind of an even spacing that I dislike, and it doesn't really match the photo too well. So I want to kind of break that up. I want to be aware of not evenly spacing the forms. And so when I'm using my eraser, I'm doing the same thing as I do with a pencil, lifting off, kind of rocking the eraser. So there's often a tendency I see in students to try to get in there and really render each and every mark on in a reflection and make it nice and crisp and sharp. But I find that often, it overstates things, and we're kind of losing an opportunity to allow the materials to do what they do best. And that's something that we've talked about in previous drawings, but kind of it's been a while since I've really talked about it. But as you settle in on a medium that you're going to be using, whether you're using charcoal or graphite, the texture of the paper, etc., really ask yourself, what is inherent in the material that I can leverage in the drawing? What is its quality that I can utilize and kind of honor and respect in the drawing? And so in this case, the graphite is very kind of silvery in nature, and it allows for some control. It allows for these nice fine lines. One of the things I really like, you can start to see reflections of the trees, these vertical edges. And as I'm doing that, one of the things that's happened with the graphite is it's kind of embossed that page. It's created these fine ridges on the surface of the paper that I can use. So as I scrape across here, it still leaves some of those horizontal ridges. And as I kind of make these darker marks that represent tree trunks or telephone poles or something, I'm just kind of wiggling it back and forth to suggest areas where it's a little bit more dense in that reflection. But again, keeping them all really horizontal in nature. Very gestural in that I'm just reacting to what's in front of me. I'm not super concerned if it's exactly one-to-one, a representation of what I'm seeing in the photo. And then if I need to, I can just bear down a little bit more. But utilizing the side of the pencil rather than the point. And, allows you to create these sharp edges still because it's a cylindrical form. When I'm making contact with the paper, it's only happening at a single point along that cylinder of the pencil core. So you can create really fine lines without having to use the point. And I suggest doing that as much as possible, so then you can really preserve that sharp point for areas in the bird, for example, where it gets really kind of tight and refined. So just kind of scraping. If you need more support, you kind of use your fingers on here to kind of give yourself support. And if you actually run your fingers across the top of the page, that helps to ensure that it's a horizontal mark. And bearing down in certain areas where it's a little bit darker. Just kind of let the materials do work for you. And if you kind of hold in your mind really and react to what's happening on the page, that gestural mark conveys a lot of information. And sometimes we forget to allow just kind of gestural marks to stand for themselves. So we want to get in there and render every little detail, but you can convey so much in just a quick gesture. So hopefully that makes sense. I'm feeling more confident in that reflection at the top, and because it's off in the distance, we can let that stay fairly light and less detailed. Let's see, and I think what I want to do is kind of soften some of this area, almost vignette it a little bit, kind of pull out some more light. So this is just the kneaded eraser. And so I'm pulling out a little bit more light around the bird, so then I can create this nice silhouette. One of the things I did too in this reference photo is I used Photoshop to adjust the levels. So in the original photograph, the bird was really silhouetted. So I took some time to adjust that level so I could see some of that texture in the bird, and I feel like that really helped serve me well for this drawing, because otherwise I'd just be kind of inventing stuff there for that bird. Actually, what I want to do, really like that shape, that negative space around that neck. So I'm kind of just cleaning up that area around there, giving myself a bit kind of cleaner paper. All right. Just checking here. What do you think about the woodless pencils for shading, etc.? So Linda, those are great. Actually, you know, I have a set of those woodless pencils, and honestly, I don't know why I'm not using them. I think they look great. It's just one of those things where I forgot I had them. So those work great because it gets you essentially what I have here, where just a solid stick of graphite. So what I want to do as I work on the bird is I want to be thinking about building it almost from the inside out. So there's this general axis to the bird, and I want to find that form as a shape rather than outlining it and then filling it in. And the reason I want to do that is I still want to convey a sense of three-dimensionality to it. There's a lot of structure there. I love the change in texture from the top, those feathers that, you know, he jumped into the water, jumped right back out, and then shook himself off, and he went poof. And I thought that was perfect because when I saw him prior to jumping in the water, it was a nice photograph, but you know, I love all these little spikes that he ended up with. So again, using the side of the pencil, I'm kind of working my way out to try to find that edge. And as I need to sharpen it, I can just kind of roll my pencil up a little bit to give kind of a sharper point, but I want to keep that line nice and light. If I bear down too much right now, then it really embeds that graphite into the page, and it becomes more permanent. I think more permanent than I want it to be at this stage. I want the ability to adjust and correct those proportions as I need to. So just keeping that pencil on its side and looking for these kind of compound curves in the bird, especially along that bottom. We have this kind of general curve here, but when you follow along that edge, you know, it's constantly changing, and I want to try to observe that. And as I get in here on that neck, I'm doing the same thing, trying to think in terms of shape rather than line. One of the things that can really throw people off early on is, you know, when working on proportions, if we start off by looking at the line, it can often be incorrect. We interpret the size and the shape of things differently when we see them as outlines or contour lines than when we see them as a solid shape. So I feel like for me, it's really helpful to try to get to an understanding of the shape as quickly as possible. And then work my way out to the edges, and then I can add the line in later. So I'm looking for that angle of the bill, and you can see that I'm extending those marks. That's not quite right. It needs to be a bit longer. And then just that rough shape of the cap that he's got. And I want to see, as we follow along that S curve, it's not an even S. It's a little bit wider here at the top, and there's like the straight edge right on the inside. There's rounded on the outside. And then as we come in under here, it comes back up. It does this really cool broken neck kind of thing going on there. It's a really graceful creature, so they're all over the place here in Colorado. One of the things I didn't realize until moving to Colorado is that we actually have pelicans here. You know, that is crazy to see them flying around up here, but here they are. I've seen them in this pond as well. They weren't here on the day I was out taking photos. All right, so kind of roughing that in. I want to make sure that I'm seeing it as a shape properly before I get too much farther. And now I can start to place the legs. Actually, I feel like the body needs to get a little bit bigger. That feels a little bit better to me. And one of the things I'm doing is I'm looking up at the drawing in front of me on the screen that's now vertical and a little bit more distant, because I feel like I'm correcting things in perspective from my angle here as I'm looking across the page. So, all right, that feels a little bit better just looking at that space there. Again, I need to clean up those edges a little bit. But now I can start to, I'm going to start by in these legs, I'm going to start by looking at these kind of triangular dark forms that create the legs. One of the things that's helpful is to look at some of that negative space, so the space between the legs. These little thin slivers in there. So something like that. And then while that basic form is kind of fresh in my mind, I want to actually start to block in that reflection there too. And the reflection, it only looks like one of those legs, or those legs have kind of merged together in that reflection. But I'm just trying to, what I'm doing is measuring vertically, kind of point to point. Let's see if I take that height there, take that height, so the back is somewhere around here, and it all gets broken up by that water. So I don't need to be super precise, but it's helpful for me to know, kind of hold in my mind the general shape of the reflection, almost as if imagining if it was crystal clear here, what that might look like. And again, I just want to make sure everything kind of fits in there. Mostly that's dark mass down here is kind of most important. So that's feeling comfortable. All right, so now what I can do, let's see, questions here. All right, Heather, you're asking, you have those graphite blocks. Those are actually great to use. I love working with those. I can't remember how they're graded in terms of darkness, but if they're similar to pencils, the higher you go in the B values, the darker it's going to be. So a 2B is very similar to a regular number 2 pencil. A 4B is going to be a little bit softer and a little bit darker. 6B, again, is darker and softer than that, up to 8B. And I would, really kind of consider utilizing them in an overhand grip. So then you can use the sharp edge of that block as you need to for some of these lines here. Almost like if I imagine this were a block, you can kind of scrape it across this way here and then tilt it up on its point when you need a sharper point, and then lay it down flat to get a sharper edge when you need it there. Hopefully that makes sense. It's been a while since I've used those, but that's very similar to how I use charcoal sticks. Okay, I just want to kind of erase out some of these forms, doing some negative drawing around the bird. Yeah, that worked a little bit better than that Kneaded eraser. This needs a little bit more elbow grease. All right. So now I want to get even darker. I'm feeling more confident with the mass of the bird. Actually, you know what I'll do is I'll bring in my shading stump. This kind of fills in some of those gaps in the page, some of the tooth of the paper, and helps me to see the real value of it. And it also allows me an opportunity to adjust and correct the form. Like I can kind of bring that form out a little bit more around the neck. Adding a little bit of that, we really lose that edge along the top, which is kind of exciting. And these long feathers that kind of poke up over there. What I love about the shading stump, though, is it helps me to visualize that form in terms of shape rather than line. go. Okay, and I think what I want to do actually now is maybe I'll pull out this carbon pencil. So this carbon pencil is kind of a cool tool that I hadn't used a whole lot prior to this, but it's kind of like a cross between graphite and charcoal. It's a bit darker than the ebony pencil, but not quite as dark as charcoal. So I'm trying to keep the pencil on its side, and I've got this kind of wisp of this long feather that comes across the crown of the head, and I just want to find that path before I commit to it. I'm going to kind of practice it. And it gets lighter and then darker right here at the base, at the top of the head there. Place that in there, start to look for some additional detail. But I want to be selective about where I darken and sharpen, because that soft edge is actually helpful in terms of creating that texture. And there's the bill here. And then as we come in under here, I want to look for areas of light and dark. I'm going to switch back to this overhand grip so I can utilize the side of that pencil to kind of mimic the feathers. And what I'm looking for is shapes of the dark. And again, trying to think in terms of shape more than anything. So rather than drawing a line and filling it in, I'm looking to kind of make these marks accumulate together to create a shape. This is just thinking a little bit more than in some other areas, so I'm trying to focus on these general shapes because I want to be careful not to make any of these dark shapes too big. Just kind of flicking down for these lower feathers here that are silhouetted against that background. And so you can see the form starting to really come together here. All right, Heather, I'm glad that those comments made sense to you. So it gets a little bit darker, more silhouetted, kind of a sharper edge along in here. But really observe how that edge changes. You know, it's really dark down in here, gets a little bit lighter as we roll across the top, and there's more reflected light hitting this edge. There's less underneath this side of the bird. So switching to this grip here on the side, it helps me to keep that point sharp. Let me get that. Get those legs in there. It's hard to tell what's happening here in terms of which knee joint belongs to which leg. So with this overhand grip, I can just quickly roll my hand and I get this nice fine point, and then drop it back down to work on a side a little bit. And I like this little triangle of light under here, so I want to get that back. All right. So now back up here, we're going to continue to kind of refine, add a little detail. Let's see. And hopefully, you know, what you, or at least what I really want out of my drawing is a sense that when I step back from it, it all comes together. And sometimes adding too much detail, especially if our nose is right up against the paper, sometimes adding too much detail, it all falls apart from a distance. And so I'm looking at that screen above me too to help me visualize what it would look like if I step back a bit. It gets darker under here. So just be kind of careful with that detail. Feels all right. Let's see. I want to kind of emphasize this dark form here a little bit more. Back to the shading stump, kind of smooth things out, and I'm looking for the form here. You know, so there's light. It's a little bit lighter up here on that shoulder. It's darker down in here. And if I keep my marks fairly rough, they'll simulate the texture of the feathers. And then they get really dark under these, right underneath these long feathers here. And that's what creates that layered effect. I'll use my kneaded eraser to pull out a little bit of a highlight here across the top. Give that a little bit more form. And I'm going to sharpen this down into a sharp wedge. And try to pull out some of the light on these kind of longer stringy feathers here. So there's a lot of this kind of back and forth nature to the drawing, you know, laying it down, using the eraser to lift off. But each pass you're gradually refining. And I can, some of these darker areas to suggest the feathers, these kind of softer feathers underneath, really kind of round out. Longer tail feathers here. All right, so I'm pretty happy with that. I think I need to shade this a little bit more, create a little bit more contrast in here. And then it's a little bit darker on this right side here, as the light's a little bit stronger on that, and that'll help to make that neck feel more rounded. So you can see that along that S-curve, it's not really a sharply defined edge. It's not one line that follows down the whole thing. I'm looking for variation along that S-curve, and that will help to create a kind of a sense of atmosphere and space around the bird. So hopefully that makes sense. Again, that original photograph that I took when I first opened it up, that bird was largely silhouetted, but I was able to adjust the levels in Photoshop so that I could see them more clearly, see the form in that shadow more clearly. And it's one of those big differences between observing from life and working from a photograph, is in life I could see the bird very clearly, you know, using silhouette, but I didn't have any trouble seeing the texture of the feathers there. But the camera had to make a decision in terms of its exposure, and it chose to kind of darken the shape of the bird. So, all right. So now I'm going to kind of work my way down. I think I want to get onto that log right now. I'm going to use my Ebony Pencil again. I think I need to smooth it out so that texture is starting to interfere with the form. So again, working my way kind of from the center out to find the edges, thinking back and forth between the photograph and the drawing, gathering information about the angles, the shapes, and then making adjustments as I go. And you can see in the photograph too that we really get a lot of light on this edge here. So I don't want to get too dark with that. All right, so as I have that lighter, now I can look for some of these darker areas. Actually, that might be a great spot here. There's this crack right here on the top. So I'm looking for that shape of the shadow. And it's going to read as a shadow if I don't go right up to the edge. There's this thin sliver of that lighter value that forms the edge of that log, and that'll help to make it feel more like a shadow, like it's rounded. And I'm just going to, without correcting the proportions too much in my drawing, I'm just going to start to try to replicate the shape of the lights and the darks across this surface. It's a little bit rougher, and I'm looking for the shapes, the shadows here as I'm using this carbon pencil. As long as that general shape of the log is okay, I feel like I have a little bit of wiggle room in terms of the accuracy within the log itself. And here there's this lower kind of lip right above the water that's in light, and then right underneath it, it gets in shadow again. You get this dark edge along the water. And it gets kind of bumpy and gnarled here. So I'm just trying to block in these larger values here. Go back to my shading stump, kind of adjust a little bit. Again, reacting to the grain of the wood as I see it, very gestural thinking here. It's not necessarily about trying to mimic the exact marks, but mimic the flow of the form. Now I'm gonna, before I lift off any lighter areas, I want to get my darks placed. I think this edge needs to be sharp, right there. Karen, you're asking if a dark Prismacolor, black Prismacolor can be used in place. I think so. I definitely think it's worth the shot. I know with colored pencils, they're different mediums. Some are kind of wax-based, some are oil-based, and I can't remember what Prismacolors are. But that might be the only thing is if it resists the graphite. With the graphite, we're taking off a fair amount of the tooth of the paper, and so it may be difficult for it to hold on, but there's no rule against it, so I would certainly give it a shot, see what happens. It could give you some nice contrast there. All right, so I think that works out pretty well. I like that form of the log. I'm squinting my eyes a little bit to see, make sure I kind of captured the general shapes of the lights and darks. Let me try to get some more of that texture in there, and I think I need that carbon pencil, and just in a few key areas to add some depth. Not along the edges. I want to bring that depth into the core, and that'll have that'll help to reference the volume a bit more effectively. So I'm leaving my darkest darks here in the center, and so it gets, if anything, gets a little bit lighter as we move around the drawing. All right, so here we go. I think we're going to start to get into the reflections here. And as I mentioned earlier, there's kind of a choppy quality to the reflections right around in here in the base, and so I want my eraser to kind of skip across the page. and still constantly looking. Something like that is really easy to get absorbed in the technique and stop looking, but you always want to be looking, always want to be reacting to the subject here. And so I'm just looking at the lines here. They kind of get a little bit more rounded. There's bigger, ripples here. And the eraser can be a really effective shading tool, kind of blending tool as well. So if you just kind of keep the touch light, it can make some interesting effects there. So essentially doing some negative drawing here, looking at the general lines of the reflections of the water. An 8B, Karen, you're asking about an 8B for the carbon pencil. I would think so. That's pretty darn dark. That's a really strong, solid equivalent to an ebony pencil, which gets very dark. That's what this one is here. I would give that a shot. That might be the most effective. All right. So now I'm just kind of thinking through some of the dark marks that I'm seeing. Again, not necessarily trying to replicate it one-to-one, but using it as an indicator of what's happening on the surface of the water, where the ripples are a bit more, a bit stronger, where they're softer. I need to thin that out a little bit. I like the way that horizontal dark ripple kind of anchors it on this side, and then on this side we can break that up a little bit. And then there's kind of a series of shorter dark marks. There's one dominant one in here, and then a little bit on this. I'm going to use the side of my pencil. A little bit lighter on the end, a little bit heavier in the middle. And I'm just kind of wiggling it just lightly as I move across. I'm just going to let my pencil kind of skip across the surface a little bit in some areas. I feel like this could be lightened up and along in here. And again, I've mentioned this before, but I have this eraser, and it's really easy to think of it as purely a correction tool. But you always want to be contributing to the form of the drawing. And so even as I'm adjusting marks, I'm hopefully kind of contributing to that form and defining something. And so I'm noticing along in here, these ripples start to round out a little bit, slightly around the stump. I'm kind of saving this for later. I'm going to work from the outside in. And what I like about this grip, again, is as I move my arms kind of horizontally, I have this as a guide to help me keep things horizontal. I'm just letting these marks kind of skip across the surface, hopefully in a way that mimics the type of lines that I'm seeing in the reference photo, not necessarily a one-to-one match for the reference photo. And here we have this we have these two main ripples that we can see in the reference, but this bottom one doesn't continue on. It's a little bit darker in the middle and kind of trails off, and then we pick up a little bit more down here. And so I want to be mindful of this general path along here. There's no line, but our brain starts to continue that on. We can start to see that almost like a constellation. And so I want to be aware of that and make sure that that's placed properly. So similarly to how we were dealing with the reflections up there, I'm just creating these horizontal marks, keeping it light and kind of sneaking up on those marks. I'm kind of losing the point on the end there, so I'm going to tip it on its side, and that'll actually get me a sharper edge. So I want to observe the shape of the darks. There's a little bit of reflection of that stump under here, and then it breaks up. So hopefully this makes sense and gives you a little bit more confidence when dealing with the reflections in water. A lot of it is allowing the eraser and the graphite to kind of do what they do and react on the page, rather than really trying to render each and every individual ripple. If you understand ultimately what you're looking at and really can kind of see the changing shapes of those ripples as they move across the page and across the surface of the water, then you're going to be in good shape. So here I'm noticing, again, that these ripples are a bit farther apart here. This is much closer to us. We're looking down at it more. As we lift up, they get narrower and narrower and thinner. And so I want my marks to kind of reflect that. Let's see. All right. I think I can come back in and kind of pull out some of the highlights in between, where the light's catching a little bit higher there. So again, moving back and forth between the eraser and the graphite. And then this leg comes down under here. So I'm looking at it at the leg above it to try to make sure that they generally match. In the reflection, it really kind of wavers, but you can see I've got my pencil on its side. I'm just trying to hold in my mind the general shape I'm seeing in the reference, and then try to somewhat match it, but it's not a one-to-one match. I just want to make sure I get the general shape right. All right, C.C. Franklin talking about the eraser. Yeah, the eraser is such a huge aspect. There are two things that we often overlook actually in the drawing process, and one of them's the eraser, the other's the paper. We get so consumed in thinking about the material. Are we using graphite versus charcoal, etc.? We'll often then make, we'll kind of just not think about the paper that we're using or the eraser. We kind of forget that those are equal parts of the drawing as well. So I like to think of drawing very similarly to how I paint. So it's a very kind of painterly approach, which is kind of additive and subtractive. So you're adding with the graphite, you're subtracting with the eraser, but you're always contributing to the form. So as I work my way down here, I want to be careful about the general shape of the ripples down in here. It's a little bit easier to see in the digital image than it is on this printout, but I can see that there's kind of this crossover happening at that bottom, and so I want to start to kind of mimic that as well. But I kind of like this vignetting that's happening, a little bit darker in these corners, a little bit lighter. That helps to pull us into the center a little bit more. So I'm just using the side of the eraser here, and I want to start to kind of see how we have a kind of a crisscrossing of these reflections. So as I make these marks, the eraser is not making contact the entire span of my marks. They're just kind of, it's almost like my hand is making the path and my eraser is dropping down along that path just in a few key areas. and that helps to make it feel more naturalistic. All right, I kind of like what's happening down in there. It's kind of starting to reference that kind of rippling, and it makes it's a bit more solid there. That's one of the hard things about working with water, is that you're looking at two different things at the same time. You're looking at the surface of the water, but you're also looking at whatever is being reflected by the water that's off in some other place in space. And so oftentimes when you're trying to render it, it's it's a challenge. You almost have to decide sometimes, what am I doing? Am I drawing the reflection? Am I drawing the surface plane of the water? And every now and then you find somebody who can just do both. All right. So I just want to be careful not to kind of overdo it here. I think it's going to be most effective to, I have that general shape. I want to try to make these marks in a confident way, without kind of over rendering. So I'm trying to hold that shape in my mind, and then these are dark marks, but I want to just kind of commit to them before I go. So it's taking a little bit more concentration. So I'm trying to visualize that path, looking at the bird above, making sure that all aligns, looking at the reference photo to see what information exists there that I can utilize. But you can see that one of the things I'm trying to hold in my mind is that these marks here need to be more spread out. They need to be darker, bolder, to contrast against what I have back here. And then this really gets broken up along in here by those ripples. Just keeping these marks horizontal to kind of mimic the shape of those reflections. But I think I'm feeling pretty good about that. So I think that's largely it. I don't know what else we have really left to do. I don't want to overwork it. I feel like I could probably go dark back in here, but I like that I've got some value contrast where the darkest darks are here in the focal point. That brings your eye right to that and allows that to settle back, almost like I want that to be an afterthought. And that kind of happens in real life as well, is that our brain can be consumed by that object and everything else fades away. There could be something major happening up here that we're not even aware of because that's drawing our attention. So I think we can let our drawing kind of have that similar effect. All right, just checking back here for any questions, but it doesn't look like there are any. This went a lot faster than I expected. If you're new to this drawing series here, I'm Scott. I'm with Artist Network. This is Drawing Together. We're on episode 26, something like that. Yeah, I believe it's 26 now. We meet every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 3 p.m. Eastern. We are starting a new schedule next week. We've got the holiday on Monday, and I'm going to try posting a recording rather than doing a live session because I'm going to be on vacation. So we'll have a brand new recording on Monday, and then we're going to meet again on Wednesday. But we're going to try out a cadence of doing just every Monday and Wednesday to see how that works for everybody. But we're going to keep doing this series kind of indefinitely. We don't really have an end in sight. Check out artistnetwork.com. If you go to the Drawing Together page, right off there off the home page at the very top, you'll see a link to Drawing Together. You open that up, you have a lot more resources for drawing, and we also have show pages for each of the episodes. You can go, and people have started sharing the work that you've all been creating, as well as discussing with each other the work that you got. So it's been really cool seeing the work that you all have been doing. So check that out on artistnetwork.com. This has been a blast. On Friday, we're doing that gnarled tree that I took a photo of on the, just prior to this, before taking this reference photo. So I'm really excited by that one. So I may just kind of poke around on this for a little bit more to see if anybody has any lingering questions. I want to hang out here for you all, but I feel like for the most part we've done a decent enough job to call it a day. So I want to thank you all for joining. This has been a blast, and have fun in your own work. Like I said, I'm just going to hang out here for a little bit. Oftentimes I'll get like one question as the last thing right after I've signed off, and I want to try to avoid that today. So thank you all. These are eraser bits. Oh, Jerry, you have a question about where to share. So if you go to artistnetwork.com, there should be links in the description underneath the video. There is a page for drawing together. So right there on the home page at the very top, you'll see drawing together. That will link you to a number of resources for drawing, and you'll see a whole list of each episode that we've done here. And if you click on those links, that'll take you to the individual pages where you can see what people have been working on. We saw some great alpacas, some wonderful hair drawing. The skulls were fantastic. We've got a horse. And then, for those of you who would like to share suggestions about what you'd like to have me draw, once this is done, it'll go up as a video on YouTube, and there's a new discussion thread that gets formed around that video. And so if you want to post your suggestions there, it becomes a bit easier. I sometimes lose track of suggestions when they're in the live chat discussion field that we have going on here. So be sure to put that in the discussion thread for the recorded video. Or you can go to Artist Network onto those show pages and add them there as well. Some people have connected on Instagram, Facebook, things like that. That's been awesome as well. So, all right, it looks like we got all the questions here. Hopefully this was helpful. We covered a lot with the reflections, the texture of the bird, the form. I will see you all on Friday.